The words hung in the air like poison. For 40 years of hosting television, Steve Harvey had heard thousands of answers, witnessed countless moments of joy and disappointment, but he had never heard anything that made him physically step backward from his podium. The entire Family Feud studio fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the cameras seemed deafening, and the Williams family is going to play against them for double the money. Because that's what happens when you face hatred with dignity. That's what happens when you represent your family and your community with class. That's what happens when you show the world what real strength looks like. The game that followed was unlike anything that had ever been broadcast on Family Feud. Sharon, still wearing Steve's jacket, answered questions with a confidence that seemed to grow with each round. Her family rallied around her, their love and support visible to everyone watching. The improvised opposing team, made up of show staff members, played with joy and enthusiasm, celebrating every correct answer the Williams family gave. When Sharon stepped up for the final fast money round, Steve walked over to her once more. "Sharon," he said, "before we finish this, I want to ask you something. How do you do it? How do you keep going when people try to tear you down? How do you keep serving others? Keep being strong for your family? Keep believing in goodness when you face what you face today?" Sharon looked at Steve, then at the audience, then at her family, gathered around the podium. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "Because that's what love looks like," she said simply. "Love doesn't stop loving because someone else stops seeing your worth. Love doesn't quit because someone else quits on you. My family taught me that my value doesn't come from what other people think about me. It comes from what I know about myself, what I give to others, and what I stand for when it's hard to stand." The silence that followed was profound. In a television studio filled with lights and cameras and entertainment equipment, a nurse from Detroit had just delivered a sermon on human dignity that reached deeper than any scripted moment ever could. The Williams family won $40,000 that day, but more importantly, they won something that couldn't be measured in money. They won the knowledge that when hatred showed its face, love showed up big. They won the understanding that sometimes strangers become family when it matters most. They won proof that their dignity was worth defending, and that they didn't have to defend it alone. The episode aired 6 weeks later, exactly as it happened. The network had debated heavily about whether to broadcast the incident, whether to edit out Tom Patterson's comment, whether to present the story differently, but Steve Harvey had insisted that the truth be told exactly as it occurred. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The show received over 50,000 letters and emails from viewers sharing their own stories of facing prejudice and finding strength. Sharon Williams became a guest speaker, not as a game show contestant, but as someone who had shown the world what grace under pressure looked like. The jacket that Steve gave Sharon became a symbol. She wore it to every speaking engagement, every interview, every moment when she wanted to remember that her worth was recognized and defended by someone who barely knew her but understood her humanity. Steve Harvey said in later interviews that Sharon's episode changed him as a host and as a person. "I realized that day that my platform isn't just about making people laugh," he said. "It's about using my voice when someone needs an advocate, about standing up when someone else can't, about proving that television can be a force for good when good people refuse to stay silent." The empty podium where the Patterson family had stood became a reminder for everyone who worked on the show. A reminder that some things matter more than ratings, more than entertainment, more than keeping everyone comfortable. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is make someone uncomfortable with their prejudice while making someone else comfortable in their own skin. Sharon Williams returned to her job at Detroit Medical Center, but she carried something new with her, the knowledge that her dignity had been publicly defended, that her worth had been proclaimed on national television, that her strength had inspired others. She still wears Steve's jacket to work sometimes, and her colleagues know exactly what it represents. Years later, when Sharon's nephew, Marcus, graduated from nursing school, he sent Steve Harvey a photo. It showed him wearing his graduation cap and gown, standing next to his Aunt Sharon, who was still wearing that navy blue jacket. The note that came with it was simple: "Thank you for showing me what it means to stand up. Now I'm ready to stand up for others." The day Sharon Williams faced hatred with grace, Steve Harvey learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop the show, stop the entertainment, stop the performance, and start standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs something, even when it breaks every rule you're supposed to follow. Because some moments are bigger than television. Some moments require choosing between being popular and being right. And on that Tuesday afternoon, in a Family Feud studio, Steve Harvey chose right, and Sharon Williams showed the world what silent strength looks like when it finds its voice. His expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something much deeper. This wasn't just an inappropriate comment. This was an attack on everything he stood for, everything this show represented, everything he believed about how people should treat each other. Sharon's reaction was what broke Steve's heart. She didn't get angry. She didn't shout back. She didn't storm off the stage. Instead, she did what she had learned to do through decades of facing prejudice. She absorbed a blow silently. Her shoulders sagged slightly. Her proud smile faded. She looked down at her hands and tried to compose herself, tried to protect her family from the embarrassment, tried to be strong for everyone else, even as her own spirit was being crushed. But this time, she wasn't alone. Steve Harvey dropped his cards right there on the studio floor. The sound echoed through the silent studio like a judge's gavel. He walked directly to the Patterson family podium, his face showing an intensity that no one in that studio had ever seen from him. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that transcended entertainment. "Sir," Steve said, looking directly at Tom Patterson, "what did you just say?" Tom Patterson's smirk faltered. The reality of what he had done, the fact that it had been reddened, the fact that Steve Harvey was now standing 3 feet away from him asking for clarification, began to sink in. It was a joke, Steve. You know how it is." "No," Steve replied, his voice getting quieter but somehow more powerful. "I don't know how it is. Explain it to me." The cameras kept rolling, but everyone in the studio knew this was no longer a game show. The producers in the control room were frantically whispering into their headsets, unsure whether to cut to commercial, unsure whether to stop rolling, unsure whether this moment would ever be allowed to air. But Steve Harvey had made his decision. Behind the scenes, Steve made a choice that defied every producer's expectation and every rule of television entertainment. He walked away from Tom Patterson without another word and approached Sharon at her family's podium. When he reached her, he did something unprecedented in the history of game shows. He placed his hand gently on Sharon's shoulder and spoke directly to her, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the audience, ignoring everything except the woman in front of him, who needed to know she wasn't alone. "Sharon," he said softly, but his wireless microphone picked up every word and carried it throughout the studio. "I need you to look at me." Sharon raised her eyes to meet Steve's. In them, he saw pain that went far beyond this month. He saw years of similar encounters, decades of having to prove her worth, a lifetime of being judged by her appearance rather than her character. But he also saw strength, the kind of strength that comes from refusing to be broken, from continuing to serve others even when others refuse to see your humanity. "Sharon," Steve continued, "I want you to know something. What that man just said, that's not who you are. That's who he is. And in my house, in this studio, On this stage, that kind of thinking doesn't belong. Steve turned to address the entire studio, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had found his true purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do something that's never been done in the history of Family Feud. We're going to stop this game. The audience stirred. This wasn't a commercial break. This wasn't a technical difficulty. This was Steve Harvey, the face of Family Feud, making a decision that could cost him his career, cost the network money, cost everyone in that studio their moment on television. But some things were more important than television. The Patterson family, Steve announced, your participation in this show is over. You need to leave this stage right now. Tom Patterson started to protest. Now wait a minute, Steve. I drove all the way from Atlanta. We have a right to be here. It was just a comment. Steve walked back to Tom Patterson, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but carried the weight of every person who had ever faced prejudice and found someone willing to stand up for them. You had a right to be here, Steve said. You lost that right when you decided to attack a woman's dignity based on the color of her skin. You lost that right when you brought hatred into a place that's supposed to be about family, about joy, about bringing people together. You lost that right when you showed everyone in the studio and everyone watching at home exactly what kind of man you are. The Patterson family left the stage. The audience watched in stunned silence as they gathered their belongings and walked out of the studio. Some audience members began to applaud, slowly at first, then building to a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. But Steve wasn't finished. He returned to Sharon, who was now openly crying, not from shame, but from the overwhelming relief of having someone stand up for her, someone say that her dignity mattered, someone prove that she didn't have to face this alone. Steve Harvey did something, then, that no game show host in television history had ever done. He took off his suit jacket, the perfectly tailored navy blue jacket that had become part of his television persona, and he placed it around Sharon's shoulders. Sharon, he said, his own voice thick with emotion, you came here today representing your family. But today, you're representing something bigger. You're representing everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. Everyone who has ever been judged by something they can't control. Everyone who has ever had to be strong in the face of hatred. He paused, making sure every person in that studio understood the importance of what he was saying. And you know what? You did it with grace. You did it with dignity. You did it the way your family raised you to do it. That man tried to diminish you, but all he did was show everyone here what real class looks like, and it's standing right here wearing my jacket. The applause that followed wasn't television applause. It was human recognition of a moment when someone chose to do the right thing, when someone chose to stand up rather than stay silent, when someone chose to use their platform for something more important than entertainment. But Steve still wasn't done. He walked to center stage and addressed the audience directly. This is what we're going to do, he announced. The Williams family came here to play Family Feud, and that's exactly what they're going to do. But they're not going to play against another family. They're going to play for something bigger. Steve gestured to the production booth. We're going to bring out 5 of our writers, our producers, our crew members, people who work on this show every day, people who believe in what this show stands for. Her nephew Marcus had gotten Watch TV for the #1 answer. Her brother Jerome had scored with Take a Shower. The Williams family was building momentum, and the audience was cheering them on. That's when Tom Patterson, the father of the competing family, leaned into his microphone during what should have been a routine moment and said the words that would change everything. Well, at least they know how to work, he said with a smirk that made his intentions clear. Unlike most of their kind, the studio didn't go silent immediately. A few people laughed nervously, thinking they had misheard. Others looked around confused, wondering if this was part of some joke they didn't understand. But Sharon heard every word clearly. She felt them hit her like a physical blow, felt 45 years of similar comments, similar assumptions, similar moments when her humanity was reduced to the color of her skin. Steve Harvey stopped mid-sentence. He had been walking toward the Patterson family to interact with them after their next answer, but Tom's words made him freeze in place. For several seconds, Steve stood in the middle of the stage, processing what he had just heard. She was the one who had raised her teenage nephew when her sister couldn't. She was the one who held their family together through every crisis, every struggle, every moment when giving up seemed easier than going on. Standing at the podium in her best navy blue dress, the one she'd saved for months to buy, Sharon felt proud. Proud of her family, proud of how far they'd come, proud to represent the Williams name on national television. She had no way of knowing that in less than 10 minutes, that pride would be tested in a way she never could have imagined. The game had progressed normally through the first 2 rounds. Both families were competitive, the energy was high, and Steve was in his element. During the 3rd round, the category was announced: name something people do to relax after work. Sharon's family had control of the board, and the answers were flowing smoothly. The Williams family, from Detroit, was facing off against the Patterson family, from suburban Atlanta. Both families had driven hundreds of miles for this opportunity. Both carried hopes of winning the $20,000 prize, and both had no idea they were about to become part of television history. Sharon Williams had been excited for weeks about this moment. As the oldest of 5 siblings, she'd been chosen to represent her family, not just because of her quick wit, but because of her strength. She was the one who had worked double shifts at Detroit Medical Center to put her younger brother through college. 300 audience members sat frozen, unsure if what they just heard was real. And Sharon Williams, a 45-year-old emergency room nurse from Detroit, stood at her family's podium with tears threatening to spill from eyes that had seen too much pain in one lifetime. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The Tuesday afternoon taping had started like any other, with Steve working his magic, making families laugh, creating those moments of connection that had made Family Feud America's favorite game show.